Welcome back to Subversive Preacher. It sure is nice to be in the midst of summer. But I cannot pretend to get inside Joe Biden's head. But my guess is he doesn't want to give up. I'm guessing he just doesn't want to let go. And maybe it's not just the power and the prestige, although there is no doubt those are golden handcuffs. Now, I'm using Joe as an example here, by the way. This is not some political diatribe. So I suspect, like all of us, he doesn't want to let go and have to say to himself he's got nothing left. I mean, who among us ever wants to just admit that we've got nothing left and that we can't make a difference to the universe around us? If I can tell you a story on Bunny Bell, who was a member here, and I really don't think she would mind if she was still among us. But she hated the idea of giving up, sitting in a chair in her house under hospice care, age 90 gazillion. She grimaced and said the same thing to me that she had said for nearly 10 years, which was, I hate not being able to do anything for anybody. My dad didn't retire until he was 80 from his solo shingle law practice. 80, and his practice was costing him more than it was making. And not long after he finally gave up his office and his practice, he was sitting on a lawn chair on the bank of Lake Bel Air in Michigan, watching me pull up the dock one early October. A very, very quiet man, extremely introverted. He said loud enough for me to hear him that he just hated sitting there watching me do what he had always done for the family. Now, am I strumming a familiar chord for anyone listening? Well, I have to say, I said to Bunny and I said to my dad what I say to myself and I say to you. We may be in exile, but that doesn't mean there's nothing left to do. Actually, to Bunny, I reminded her that she was still calling people all the time, several times a day, just to check on them and still giving flowers whenever she could, and that all of that was doing something as well as allowing others to care for her. To my dad, I said, to everything there is a season. But because we heard from Ezekiel today, I want to put it in terms of exile, which being on the margin feels like and is sometimes. Ezekiel is speaking to us from the year 598 BCE. That's 2,500 years ago. And it's amazing that the voice of someone who was likely psychotic, schizophrenic perhaps, and full of hallucinations and bizarre radical behavior could travel that far. 2,500 years across deserts and mountains and oceans to a little church in Geneva, New York, or to me here in this home place. The Babylonians had just swallowed up the little nation of Judah, and Ezekiel was among the first cohort to be exiled. He was a prophet priest who must have been revered, but kept at arm's length because of his wild and exotic behaviors that often accompanied or resulted from spectacular visions. He shared his visions with his fellow exiles living in some hill city on the Kebar River, in which is modern-day Iraq. God entered his body and pulled him up off his butt onto his feet, it says in today's reading, and said, "Go back in there, kid. Give it your best." Those are my words, of course. But Ezekiel was given a critical piece of information that changed the course of religion all of our religions in some ways, actually. All the people were wailing at the loss of everything, including their God, for God who had lived in the temple in Jerusalem. So now they had no God. They were in a different place. Gods were gods of place in those days. And a river god, or an ocean god, or a mountain or temple god, a fire god. But Ezekiel was there to tell them that their God was present in Tel Aviv, along the Kibar River. God, the God of Abraham and Sarah, was present beyond Jerusalem, he said, and that meant they could carry on even in Babylon. He told them more than that, of course. He, for 24 chapters, basically lambasted the people in the history of Israel with divine judgment upon their rejection of God's ways. And then for 25 more chapters, he provided visions of hope and restoration. But in the reading today, he's sharing this dramatic and uplifting discovery that God comes and goes when and wherever God pleases. God is not a God of place. God moves and is mobile and present. And Ezekiel through his visions said they proved it. So here's how I translate that for us. No one comes here to this place that we are in by accident. And I do not mean by that everything happens for a reason, because I don't believe everything happens for a reason, any more than I believe that wealth and power are a sign of God's blessing, which is nothing more than the theology of capitalism. What I mean is, you and I are here to carry on what Ezekiel promised 2,500 years ago. That God is present, even here, even now, and they shall know there has been a prophet among them. You and I are chosen for prophetic witness. And in order to succeed as prophets, we must be nestled and nurtured in the womb of community. You see, Jesus was painfully right when he said a prophet is not without honor except in her hometown and among his own kin and in her own house. And I'm guessing that you know exactly what that means, because you have had the experience of being marginalized or silenced or invisible when you tried to speak truth to power, or simply had to use uncomfortable candor among your own family and friends, or in your own home. So I suspect you know what it's like to be the odd one out when you saw and knew what others had used blinders to ignore. And if you're like me, you haven't always spoken up. We all know the pressure to sit on our voice, but the voice is in there, and we hear it. And we know what Jesus is talking about when he says the prophet is not without honor except in his or her own house. And that's what I mean, that you are not here by accident. We are here because the voice or minions of voices have ushered us here, even if we don't know why, and even if we are unconscious of it. And once here, waiting for you and me, in this womb of community is a voice that may or may not have words. Now, I was just trying to teach my 5-year-old grandson that some things have a voice even if they don't have words. He's a very bright engineer, physicist, or scientist, or something in the making, and a keen observer of the world all around him. But he isn't naturally inclined to see the whole field, mostly just the material forms in it. So when I told him that some things have a voice but no words, he just looked at me, tilted his head, and after a moment said, "What?" To think of voice and words as two different things was a new thought for him. His grandmother told him that while he's with us, we would teach him about some mystical things. And that's what we're talking about now. mystical things like voices without words. But mystical isn't all that weird, because we know all about such things from the material, physical world around us. Your dog or your cat or your bird has a voice without words. If you have a bird, you might have words. The wind has a voice, or I should say voices, and they help amplify the voices of trees, though trees have a voice even without rustling their leaves. So it's not too far of a jump from the voices without words heard on a day-by-day basis to the voices or the voice or voices we hear without words that speak to us from within the corridors of our own heart and mind. Discerning those voices, who and what is speaking, is one of the challenges of being a spiritual person. In fact, to my way of thinking, that is what defines a spiritual person. Someone who practices listening to the voices within and around and discerning the source and the meaning of those voices. So I want to tell you something you may already know, or what you may already have built a wall of resistance around knowing. Somewhere in this womb of community, or wherever yours is a voice waiting for you and for me. And it's waiting for us to take it with us and carry it to the next person or people who need to hear it. A voice that speaks here in your heart or mind must not be left here, because this is a womb. Words left here die here because they have a limited gestation period. The words we receive here from the voice made known to us here has to leave here and be heard by those others to whom they are intended. Now, all this is not fully conscious, of course, and maybe not even a little bit. But surely you've had the experience that you heard something or learned something that was needed by yourself or by someone else, and you didn't know it or remember it until suddenly you did. That's what I'm talking about. The words or words you hear from the voice that is yours or that is not yours nor anybody else's, that voice will act like a low rumble inside with the volume of a whisper. And it will gently pulsate within. It's just a little word, a teeny tiny drop in the ocean of thoughts that form the field of vision from which we see the universe. But a single drop of rain falls in a pond isn't noticed on its own. Rather, it joins a crescendo of drops that thunder into a flood, that overrun the banks, that spills into the river, that overcomes the levees and the dams, and changes the landscape forever. We hear voices that may or may not use words. Those voices have a word or words for us to carry, to give to another or others. That's what prophecy is about. And as Ezekiel said, when we share those words, as we are guided to do, they shall know a prophet has been among them. May you hear the word that is there for you. Peace be with you.